Jack had always been fascinated by trains. As a kid, he had spent hours watching them go by, imagining where they were headed and who might be aboard. Now, as an adult, his job as a night shift security guard at the old train yard allowed him to be around them every day. The yard was quiet at night, with only the distant hum of the city in the background, and Jack enjoyed the solitude. One evening Jack was making his usual rounds. The moon was full, casting a pale light over the tracks and the rows of the rustling train cars. Most of the trains in the yard were out of service, releases from another era that had long been forgotten. Jack's job was to make sure no one messed with the old trains or the equipment stored by. He was working along the tracks when he noticed something unusual. In the distance, one of the old steam engines was sitting on the tracks, its headlight glowing faintly. This engine was a particular favorite of Jack's. It had been out of service for decades, but he liked to think about how it must have looked in its prime, shiny, powerful, and full of life. But tonight something was different. As Jack approached the engine, he noticed that the door to the conductor's cabin was open. It was always kept shut, locked to keep people away from messing around inside. Jack flounced and climbed up to check it out. The inside of the cabin was dusty and covered in corpse, just as he expected. But the control panel, usually coated in grime, had been wiped clean, the levers and buttons gleaming as if they had just been polished. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He stepped back, his flashlight's beam bouncing off the polished surfaces. Who had been inside? No one ever came here except him, and he didn't touch anything. As Jack stood there, as Jack stood there, the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the cabin. He spun around, shining his flashlight into the corners, but there was no one there. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as if someone were walking up the steps behind. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He turned toward the open door, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the door was empty. The footsteps stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Jack's pulse raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. He knew this train like the back of his hand. There was no one else here. Suddenly, the headlight of the train flicked, casting long shadows across the yard. Jack whipped around, pointing his flashlights at the control panel. The levers were moving slowly, deliberately, as if an individual hand were adjusting them. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He knew it was impossible. The engine was long dead, its parts rusted and useless. But as he watched, the controls continued to move, and a low hum filled the cabin, the sound of the engine coming to life. Panicking, Jack backed out of the cabin, nearby tripping over the steps. As he reached the ground, he heard a soft voice behind him, a whisper carried on the wind. "Ready for departure." Jack froze. The voice was old, raspy, like it belonged to someone who had spent a lifetime working on the rails. Slowly, he turned around, shining his flashlights toward the cabin. Standing in the doorway was a figure, dressed in an old conductor's uniform, his face hidden in shadow. The uniform was worn and faded, but buttons still shone in the moonlight. The man's hands were gloved, resting on the door frames. as he stared down at Jack. Jack couldn't move, couldn't speak. He just stood there, his heart pounding in his chest as the conductor slowly stepped down from the train. The man moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if he had all the time in the world. When he reached the ground, he turned to face Jack fully. The flashlight beam caught his face, pale, gaunt, with deep-set eyes that seemed to look right toward Jack's. The conductor smiled, a slow, unsettling grin that sent shivers down Jack's spine. Been a long time since we had a passenger, the conductor said, his voice low and gravelly. Jack stamped back, his mind racing. This wasn't possible. This had to be a dream, a trick of the lights. But the man standing in front of him was all too real. The conductor took a step closer, reaching into his pocket and pulling out an old, weathered ticket. He held it out to Jack, the paper yellowed with age. "Ticket, please." Jack shook his head, backing away. I don't have a ticket," he stamped, his voice trembling. The conductor's smile faded, replaced by a look of disappointment. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering something, then nodded slowly. "No ticket, no ride," he said softly, almost to himself. Jack didn't wait to see what the conductor would do next. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the empty yard. He didn't stop until he was back in the small security office. The door slammed shut behind. His heart was pounding, his breath coming in rage gasps. For the rest of the night, Jack stayed in the office, refusing to go back out into the yard. He could still see the train from the window, its headlights glowing faintly in the fog. But the conductor was gone. The cabin door closed as if nothing had happened. When morning finally came, Jack gathered his things and left without looking back. He quit the job that day, never returning to the train yard again. But the image of the ghostly conductor stayed with him, haunting his dreams and reminding him of that night. And sometime late at night, when the fog rolled in and the city was quiet, Jack would hear the faint sound of a train whistling in the distance, a lonely, mournful cry that sent chills down his spine. He knew it was the ghost conductor, still waiting for his next passenger.